Good morning, all of you. And today we are going to discuss about very important topic called as urogenital triangle. Before we explore this, please subscribe to my channel. So, when we were discussing about the general idea on the perineum, we have seen it is a diamond-shaped area which is present at the outlet of the pelvis. So, at the outlet of the pelvis, we have seen the diamond-shaped area, and we have drawn an imaginary line that which is joining the two ischial tuberosities, that it is separating the perineum into two different regions. Anteriorly we can identify urogenital triangle, posteriorly we can see the anal triangle. So what about this urogenital triangle? Let us explore now. So what is this urogenital triangle? So it is the anterior part of the pelvic outlet and presents the following. So what are the boundaries we can identify? In front you can identify the lower margin of pubic symphysis and the pubic arcuate ligament. Behind we can identify imaginary line which is joining the two ischial tuberosities. On each side we can identify the lower margin of ischiopubic ramus. Let us see that. So anterior margin we can identify the pubic symphysis, and here we can identify the arcuate pubic ligament. Arcuate pubic ligament. And posteriorly we can see we are drawing an imaginary line which is joining the two ischial tuberosities. And laterally we can identify the ischiopubic ramus. Laterally we can identify, or either side we can see ischiopubic ramus. And what are the structures present here in this urogenital triangle, and how it is present in an anatomical position? So in the anatomical position, how the triangle is facing. So when we see the anatomical position of the bony pelvis, the anterior superior iliac spine and the pubic tubercle both are present in the same coronal plane. Means when you draw a coronal plane, it has to approximate the 2 points called as anterior superior iliac spine and the pubic tubercle. In the anatomical position, the urogenital triangle is facing forwards and downwards. Forwards and downwards. So the layers which we are going to identify from outside to inside are skin, superficial fatty layer. Then we can identify the superficial membranous layer, is also called as Colles fascia, and contents of the superficial perineal pouch, perineal membrane, contents of the deep perineal pouch, and also we are going to discuss about the superior fascia of urogenital diaphragm. Okay, so this perineal membrane is also called as inferior fascia of urogenital diaphragm. So in the males, the urogenital triangle extends superficially to encompass the scrotum and the root of penis. In females, it extends to the lower limit of the labia and then mons pubis. Yes, try to see here. In this picture, you can identify in the males, this urogenital triangle extends superficially to encompass the scrotum here. And in the case of females, it is extending to the lower limit of the labia and the mons pubis. Then the urogenital triangle is divided into two parts by a strong perineal membrane. Here you can see that perineal membrane. This urogenital triangle area, it is divided into two pouches, two areas by this thick sheet called as perineal membrane. Below to this perineal membrane, that is called as superficial perineal pouch. Above it, it is called as deep perineal pouch, or we can call them as superficial perineal space and the deep perineal space. Now, the posterior margin of the perineal membrane is fused centrally to the perineal body. There is a fibrous body which is present at the midline of the perineum, and the anterior margin of the perineal membrane thickens to form transverse perineal ligament. A small gap between this ligament and the arcuate pubic ligament provides the passage of deep dorsal vein of the penis. Let me show you that. So here you can see the perineal membrane, and anteriorly you can identify this transverse perineal ligament, and there is a gap between the arcuate pubic ligament and the transverse perineal ligament. Between these two ligaments, you can identify the gap. Through this gap, deep dorsal vein of penis or deep dorsal vein of uh, clitoris is passing through the gap. Deep dorsal vein of penis in the case of males, deep dorsal vein of clitoris in the case of females. And here you can see the perineal membrane posterior aspect, and this is the anterior aspect. Now here you can identify the outermost sheet, means here we have removed the thick sheet perineal membrane, inferior layer of the urogenital diaphragm or perineal membrane. We have removed it in order to see what are the structures are present inside it. We'll discuss about these things in a few minutes. Now moving to the so here you can see the perineal membrane in the case of males, how it is giving attachment to this bulbospongiosous muscles. And here you can see the perineal body. Yeah, in this picture we can identify how the perineal membrane is giving origin to this bulbospongiosous in the middle, and posteriorly we can identify it is giving attachment to a fibrous body called as perineal body. Now what is this perineal membrane? So perineal membrane, it is a triangular or trilaminar musculofacial structure. Musculofacial structure, it is a thick, it is attached to the arcuate ligament of pubis, and is here is referred to as transverse perineal ligament. The posterior border of the perineal membrane is continuous with the deep part of perineal body at its dorsal margin and is continuous with the fascia over the superficial transverse perineal muscles. So here you can identify this is a perineal membrane, which is a thick sheet. Is a thick sheet, and it is forming the transverse perineal ligament, and it is posteriorly it is extending downwards and covers the superficial transverse perineal muscles which are present in the superficial perineal pouch. Just remember about it. In a few minutes we are going to discuss in detail about it. The transverse perineal ligament, and here you can identify the arcuate pubic ligament, the posterior aspect of the perineal membrane, and here how it is descending down and covers the or blends with the fascia over the superficial transverse perineal muscles. The description of this urogenital region, description of the layers, let us discuss about one by one. So first, skin. In the case of male, how it is present. In the case of female, how it is present. So in the case of male, we can identify there is a midline raphe, so skin which is extending from the abdomen, and it is continuous with the same skin of the penis and the skin which is covering the scrotum, and then the skin which is extending posteriorly, and on the skin we can identify the midline raphe which is separating the scrotum into two compartments, and also this same median raphe which is extending posteriorly and reaches to this perineal body or anterior margin of this anal orifice. And here you can identify the skin of a female. Here's a median raphe of the female and the in the perineum region. Then we are going to discuss about the superficial fatty layer. Superficial fatty layer, which is extension of the Camper's fascia of the abdomen, and it is crossing the line of fusion at the inguinal region or groin, and then extends downwards and reaches to the perineum as the superficial fatty layer of perineum. Okay, so just remember it is a continuation of the Camper's fascia of the abdomen. Yes, so the same superficial fatty layer which is extending into the thigh as superficial fascia of the thigh. Okay, superficial fascia of the abdomen which is extending downwards, crossing the groin, and extends as the superficial fatty layer of the perineum, and the same superficial fatty layer extending into the thigh as the superficial fascia of the thigh. And next we are moving to discuss about the Colles fascia. Colis fascia, it is very important fascia. It is an extension of the scapus fascia of abdomen. So in the abdomen, we are having two layers. The outer one is the fatty layer, inner one is membranous layer. So the membranous layer is called as scapus fascia. The outer layer is called as fatty layer called as campus fascia. So the campus fascia is extending as the fatty layer of the perineum here, and then the scapus fascia, which is extending down, and it is forming the Colis fascia. Let me explain about it in detail. Yes. So Colis fascia, regarding the Colis fascia, so as we have discussed earlier, it is an extension of the membranous layer of the abdomen. So the inside the membranous layer, which is extending down and reaches to the midline, and it is forming the fundiform ligament of penis. And this fundiform ligament of penis, it is going to bifurcate and covers the penis as the fascia of penis. And the same fascia of penis, which is extending posteriorly, and is extending as the dartos muscle. So the dartos muscle and its fascia. And then this dartos muscle, which is covering the, it is also a covering of the scrotum. It's also a covering the scrotum. Then it is extending posteriorly. Now this Colis fascia, after covering the scrotum, it is extending posteriorly as the Colis fascia. So what you have to remember is this: Colis fascia is nothing but an extension of the scapus fascia of abdomen, and the same scapus fascia of the abdomen is extending downwards and reaches to the midline and covers the penis as the fascia of penis, and then the same fascia which is forming the dartos muscle of the scrotum, and then from the, it is extending as the Colis fascia in the urogenital triangle. So that is about the Colis fascia. Then what about in the case of females? So in the case of females, so it is directly extending as the scapus fascia. It is directly extension of the scapus fascia, and it is same the Colis fascia. It is an extension of scapus fascia because there is no, the external genitalia, means elongated external genitalia. In the case of female, it is just extending as the Colis fascia. And how it is extending down and where it is going to fuse, that we have to understand. So anterior, it is going to fuse. Anterior, it is forming the fascia of the penis. On each side, it is fusing with the ischiopubic ramus, and then you can see right and left side, it is going to fuse with the ischiopubic ramus, and then posteriorly, it is going to run upwards, and then it blends with the posterior end of perineal membrane. Let me show you a sagittal section diagram to make you understand clear. In this picture, you can clearly identify how the Colis fascia, which is extending down and it is running posteriorly, and then it is ascending upwards and joins with the posterior end of perineal membrane. Here you can see the perineal membrane, and this is the perineal membrane, and this is the Colis fascia. So the perineum region, posteriorly it is closed, anterolaterally also closed. So it is open in anterior aspect only. Let me discuss about it in the upcoming slides. Then what are the structures are piercing the Colis fascia? So in the female, we can identify two orifices are present. One is anterior, you can see the urethral orifice that is piercing that and opening into the perineal outlet or pelvic outlet. The vaginal orifice, it is also piercing the Colis fascia and opening outside through the pelvic outlet. Then the nerves which are piercing the Colis fascia are, one is perineal branch of posterior femoral cutaneous nerve. Here you can see the perineal branch of posterior femoral cutaneous nerve. It is piercing the pubis fascia, and in the females, you can identify urethral orifice and the vaginal orifice. These two are piercing the pubis fascia and opening outside. Urethral, vaginal orifice. Then, what is superficial perineal pouch? What is this pouch? So far we have discussed about the pubis fascia and the skin. Then we have seen the in between the skin and the pubis fascia. We have seen the fatty layer called as the superficial fatty layer. Then we are moving deep. And first and foremost structure which we can identify is this superficial perineal pouch. So what is the superficial perineal pouch? It is an interfacial space stretching across the pubic arch and is situated below the perineal membrane. It is closed all sides except in front. So here you can see this is nothing but the superficial perineal pouch. And what are the boundaries are? Above we can identify the perineal membrane. Below we can identify the pubis fascia. Above perineal membrane, below is pubis fascia. This is perineal membrane, and here you can see the pubis fascia. Let me show you the clear boundaries of this superficial perineal pouch. Now on each side, as we have discussed about the pubis fascia, we have seen the pubis fascia which is extending down and it is attaching to the ischiopubic ramus on either side, anterolateral aspects, and posteriorly it is covering the two superficial transverse perineal muscles and then ascends upwards and joins with the posterior end of perineal membrane. So the pouch is closed on each side because it is fusing with the ischiopubic ramus, and behind it is closed by fusion of the perineal membrane, and in front it is open and is continuous with the superficial inguinal space. And this is anterolateral boundary, and here you can see the posterior boundary of this superficial perineal pouch. Yes, in this picture you can identify clearly how the superficial perineal pouch has been formed. So this pouch, inferiorly it is the pubis fascia is present, superiorly perineal membrane is present. So superficial perineal pouch inferior boundary is formed by the pubis fascia. That fascia is going to fuse anterolaterally with the ischiopubic ramus, and posteriorly it is covering the two superficial transverse perineal muscles, and it is ascending upwards and joins with the posterior end of perineal membrane. So it is closed posteriorly and it is closed anterolaterally on either sides. Then what are the contents of this superficial perineal pouch? So the contents are, number one, ischiocavernosus muscles, which are arising from the ischiopubic ramus. Then, so this ischiocavernosus is covering the crus penis or crus clitoridis. Then transverse perineal muscles, which are present posteriorly, and inferiorly they are covered by this pubis fascia, and superiorly they are covered by the perineal membrane. And these two muscles which are forming the posterior boundary of the superficial perineal pouch. And these two muscles are forming, and here it is forming the anterolateral muscle, and this muscle, superficial transverse perineal, is a posterior muscle. And the symmetrical half of the bulbospongiosus. So this bulbospongiosus, which is present at the midline of this superficial perineal pouch. So the symmetrical half of bulbospongiosus covering the bulb of penis or bulb of vestibule and the branches of pudendal vessels and the nerves, they are present in this superficial perineal pouch. So in the female, so it is crossed by the urethra anteriorly and vagina and contains the clitoris. So in the males, it contains urethra, which is passing through the root of penis. Strictly speaking, it is passing through the bulbospongiosus, which is present at the midline of the superficial perineal pouch. Through this, the urethra is passing inside. So it is fully confined space. So injuries to the contents of the space, such as bleeding into the urethra in the penile root, do not communicate with the deep or subcutaneous pouches unless the facial coverings are also lacerated or breached. Then let me discuss about this bulbospongiosis. As I told you earlier, it is present at the midline. So in the male, it lies in the midline anterior to the perineal body, and it is consisting of two symmetrical parts united by median fibrous raphe. Here you can see this median fibrous raphe. Here you can see the perineal body, and this is the median fibrous raphe. So what is going to happen? This bulbospongiosis muscles, they are extending anteriorly, and then they are going to bifurcate. They are going to bifurcate, and then they are going to join with the corpora cavernosa, which are the extensions of ischiocavernosus muscles. And in the case of female, the bulbospongiosus also attaches to the perineal body, but the muscle on each side is separated and covers the superficial parts of vestibular glands or vestibular bulbs and greater vestibular glands. So these glands are covered by this superficial perineal pouch, and also the bulbospongiosus muscle is covering these greater vestibular glands and the vestibular bulbs. Then fiber, what about how they are running? So the fibers of the bulbospongiosus in the case of female, how they are running anteriorly. So in the female, they are running anteriorly, and then on either side of the vaginal orifice to attach to the corpora cavernosa laterally, and then anteriorly they are going to join with the clitoridis, and a few fibers cross over the clitoridis and the dorsum of the, strictly speaking, the dorsum of the clitoridis and joins with the opposite side bulbospongiosus. So in the case of males, they are joining with the corpora cavernosa of which are extending of the ischiocavernosus. But what is going to happen in the case of females is these fibers are extending anteriorly, and then they cross over the dorsum of the clitoris and joins with the opposite side bulbospongiosus. And here you can see the bulbospongiosus, and this is clitoris. Then action. What about the action of this bulbospongiosus? So in both sexes, the muscle compresses the deep dorsal vein and helps in erection of penis or clitoris. In a male, it expels drops of urine from the urethra and contracts repeatedly in ejaculation. In the female, the bulbospongiosus acts as constrict the vaginal orifice and express the secretions of greater vestibular glands. Then other muscles which are present in this superficial perineal pouch are ischiocavernosus. So ischiocavernosus muscle, it covers the crus of penis. It is attached to the tendinous and muscular slips to the medial aspect of ischial tuberosity posteriorly and to the ischial ramus on both sides of the crus. So remember the origin of ischiocavernosus. It is attached from the ischial tuberosity posteriorly and then ischiopubic ramus laterally. In the female, these fibers, they are also arise from the ischial tuberosity and from the ischiopubic ramus, and then these fibers which are extending anteriorly and then cross over the clitoris and joins with each other. Then in the case of males, what we can identify is, so let me explain about the ischiocavernosus in the case of male. So the ischiocavernosus, which is arising from the ischial tuberosity and the ischiopubic ramus, as we have discussed earlier, and these fibers which are extending anteriorly and these fibers are extending anteriorly as corpora cavernosa of the penis. And this right and left corpora cavernosa means right and left ischiocavernosus muscles, they are going to attach with each other. And under the surface of this corpora cavernosa and the ischiocavernosa, we can identify this bulbospongiosus, which is attached, which is arising from the perineal membrane and also arising from the perineal body, and this bulbospongiosus extending anteriorly as corpus spongiosum. So this corpus spongiosum fibers are fused with the undersurface of the penis, means exactly the ventral surface to the ventral surface of the penis. This bulbospongiosus is attached, and then the bulbospongiosus anteriorly it attaches. It is having a elongated with the bulb-like structure or ball-like structure called as glans penis. So through this bulbospongiosus and the corpus spongiosus, we can find the penile part of the urethra, and in the glans penis you can identify external urethral orifice. So at the dorsum of this bulbospongiosus we can identify the corpora cavernosa muscles, and they are extending as ischiocavernosus, and they are extending as the corpora cavernosa of the penis. And these fibers end in an aponeurosis and is attached to the sides of and the surface of the crus penis. In the female, ischiocavernosus is related to the crus of clitoris. So here you can identify these are the fibers of ischiocavernosus and these are the fibers of bulbospongiosus. So this is the action. It compresses the action of this ischiocavernosus is it compresses the cavernous spaces of the crura and may help to maintain penile erection. And then superficial transverse perineal muscles, they are present posteriorly. They are attached to the perineal membrane superiorly, and when contracted, the two ischiocavernosi act together to stabilize the erectus penis during sexual intercourse. In the female, the ischiocavernosus may help to promote increased pressure in the clitoris. So the posterior most part of the superficial perineal pouch, we can identify two muscles, right and left, transverse perineae superficialis. So each muscle arises from the ramus of the ischium and is inserted to the perineal body at the midline. The superficial transverse perineal muscles, which are present posteriorly attached to the perineal membrane above, when contracted, the two ischiocavernosi act together to stabilize the erect penis. So here you can see the superficial transverse perineal muscles, which are rising from the ischium laterally, and then they are extending towards medially, and they get inserted to the perineal body at the midline. So here you can see the superficial transverse perineal muscles. In the case of female, how they are present. So all the fibers of the superficial transverse perineae and the bulbospongiosus, they are all going to join with the or getting inserted to the perineal body at the midline. So the vessels of the superficial perineal pouch, remember, three on each side. Two posterior scrotal or labial vessels, they are the branches of internal pudendal artery, and one transverse perineal vessels, right and left transverse perineal vessels, they are the branches of the scrotal or internal pudendal. So let me show you that. So these are the posterior branches here, and these are the anterior branches. So these are called as posterior labial branches in the case of female. Posterior labial branches. As I am showing you the female perineum section, so I am telling this branches as the posterior labial branches. And here you can see the posterior perineal branch, which is applying to the superficial transverse perineal muscle. And this is perineal muscle, perineal branch, and this is the posterior labial branch. Let me show you the posterior scrotal branches. And here you can see the posterior scrotal branches. Okay, so two pairs of posterior scrotal branches and one pair of posterior transverse perineal muscle branch. So these are the posterior scrotal, and this is nothing but the posterior transverse perineal muscle branch. So what are the nerves? So the three on each side, same name, two posterior scrotal or labial branches. They are the branches of perineal nerve, and the perineal branch of posterior femoral cutaneous nerve. Posterior femoral cutaneous nerve branch called as perineal, which is present in this superficial perineal pouch, which is piercing the collis fascia and pierces the skin. And here you can identify that posterior scrotal, and here you can see the posterior femoral cutaneous nerve. Then other structures. What are the other structures you can identify in the superficial perineal pouch? Crus penis. Crus penis or crus clitoridis attached to the ischiopubic ramus. In the case of male, the bulbospongiosus, bulb of the penis, in the midline, it attaches to the perineal membrane and it is traversed by urethra. So that particular part of the urethra is called as spongy urethra. In the female, urethral orifice is passing through that and opens through the pelvic outlet and perineum, anterior part of the perineum in the urogenital triangle. Then bulb of the vestibule and the greater vestibular glands, they are present on each side of the vaginal orifice. Then moving to the deep perineal pouch. So the deep perineal pouch, what are the boundaries of the deep perineal pouch? So we are going to discuss about these boundaries: above, below, in front, behind, on each side. So what are the deep perineal pouch boundaries? So deep perineal pouch boundaries are anteriorly what is present, posteriorly what is present. So in front we can identify transverse perineal ligament, and above we can identify the superior fascia of urogenital diaphragm, and below we can identify the perineal membrane. It is also called as inferior fascia of urogenital diaphragm, and behind we can identify the fusion of perineal membrane with the superior fascia of urogenital diaphragm. So the contents are membranous urethra, sphincter urethrae, deep transverse perineal muscles, bulbourethral glands. So they lie one on each side of the membranous urethra. They are about 1 centimeter in diameter. Their ducts pierces the perineal membrane to open into the bulb of urethra. They contribute a small amount to the seminal fluid. Let me show you the boundaries clearly. Yes, in this picture you can identify clearly the boundaries of the deep perineal pouch. Anteriorly we can identify this boundary is transverse perineal ligament, and behind we can identify, behind what is present is perineal membrane is going to fuse perineal membrane. It is called as inferior fascia of urogenital diaphragm and is extending upwards as the collis fascia and joins with the superior fascia of urogenital diaphragm. That is about the anterior and the posterior boundaries, and above is superior fascia of urogenital diaphragm and below is inferior fascia of urogenital diaphragm or the perineal membrane. Okay, so the deep perineal pouch is a small space compared with the superficial perineal pouch. So this here in this picture you can identify the sphincter urethrae, and we can identify the transverse perineal profundus muscles posteriorly at the same level of superficial transverse perineal muscles. In the deep perineal pouch, you can identify the deep transverse profundus muscle. And here you can see the sphincter urethra, which is a content of this deep perineal pouch, sphincter urethra. And how here you can see the sphincter urethra, which is encircling the membranous urethra, and transverse perineal profundus muscle, which occupies the posterior part of the pouch, both muscles supplied by the muscular branches of the perineal nerve. So this is regarding the clinical correlation of the superficial and deep perineal pouches. So if urethra ruptures below the perineal membrane, what happens? If the urethra ruptures above the perineal membrane, what happens? So below the perineal membrane, we are in superficial perineal pouch. Above the perineal membrane, that is in the deep pouch. Okay, that you have to remember. So below the perineal membrane, there is a superficial perineal pouch. So if the urethra ruptures in the superficial perineal pouch, the urine, the extravasated urine, it occupies the entire the superficial perineal pouch, so it cannot move back because posteriorly it is closed. The chorus fascia which is extending upwards and it is joining with the posterior end of the perineal membrane, so it is closed posteriorly. And anterolaterally also it cannot move because the anterolaterally they are fusing with the ischiopubic ramus of the rami of the pubic bones and the ischium, and then anteriorly only it is open. Okay, so the extravasated urine, it collected in the superficial perineal pouch, and the extravasated urine, it passed through the anterior opening and enters into the below the umbilicus part, infraumbilical part of abdomen. Then if the urethra punctures above the perineal membrane, what happens is the extravasated urine, it occupies entire the true pelvis cavity below the peritoneal fold, below the paravesical fossae, below the pararectal fossae, and also the below the supravesical fossae. So it occupies entire the anterolateral surface of the urinary bladder and the base of the urinary bladder, and anterior and the lateral surface of the rectum, and then it extends further anteriorly and then moves upwards. Okay, so in the case of female, it occupies the uterus as well, uterus and the vaginal walls and the cervix part also covered by this extravasated urine if the urethra ruptures above the perineal membrane. So that is about the clinical correlations of the superficial and deep perineal pouches. So remember, perineal membrane, urethra, if urethra punches above the perineal membrane, it occupies entire the urinary bladder, rectum, anal canal, and in the case of females, it occupies the uterus, cervix as well. If the urethra ruptures below the perineal membrane, it occupies the superficial perineal pouch, and then even it enters into the scrotal sac as well. Okay, and the penis and the infraumbilical part of abdomen. So that is about the rupture of urethra in a two different levels. So in this, from this part, we have discussed about the superficial perineal pouch and the deep perineal pouches which are present in the urogenital triangle. And in the next class, we are going to discuss about another important topic called as urogenital diaphragm. Okay, so because of the vast area of understanding, so I have just broken into two different parts. So in the first part, we have discussed about the two pouches, superficial perineal pouch and the deep perineal pouch, boundaries and contents of this. In the next class, I'm going to discuss about the urogenital diaphragm, and then I'm going to explain about the pelvic diaphragm as well. So till that, see you soon guys. Thank you.